Welcome back to the Haunted Beards coverage of Shudder's 61 Days of Halloween. Today they just dropped their new original movie, Saloom. I just gave it a watch, wanted to give you my thoughts, so let's get into it. So Saloom is a Senegalese film and the spoken language is French, and it tells the story of three mercenaries who are known as the Bengui Hyenas, who extract this drug lord, and on their getaway, their plane runs low on fuel, so they are forced to land and take a bit of a detour in the mystical town of Saloum, Senegal, and they stay there, try to keep a low profile so that they can eventually make their getaway. For me, Saloom is a film of two halves, and the first half of the movie I found to be a pretty intriguing setup, and there's some aspects of it that I thought were pretty good. The movie has a nice just kind of look to it. It's set in Senegal, and this is not a place that we see very often, even in movies, and so it definitely has a unique feel and look to it just from the setting and the location. There's some nice visuals, and just the movie kind of looks good and just kind of has its own sort of unique look and style to it. It also has some nice music that seems to be very culturally influenced that I thought just kind of provided a unique flavor and fit the movie very well. I also think there's some pretty nice camera work here, and I just think the setup is pretty interesting, and the start of the story works pretty well. It has there's just some aspects of it and some sequences that just sort of have this kind of raw energy to it in terms of just some of the handheld camera work. Looks pretty good. And for the most part, the first half of the movie is almost kind of set up like a bit of a crime thriller. And I was even kind of detecting some kind of Western vibes into it. And so the first half of the movie kind of really had me intrigued and hooked in. Unfortunately, though, once it transitions into a horror film, it kind of just lost me. And I went into this film pretty much without any sort of expectations, and I just knew that it was a horror thriller film. And so, as I said, I was kind of intrigued in that first half, and part of that intrigue as well had to do with just kind of being curious as to what sort of horror element they were going to bring into this, as I really had no clue. And so I was just kind of curious as to what the horror element would consist of. And so there's an event that happens about halfway through the movie where the movie just it kind of shifts gears and it starts to become a horror film. And so I want to talk about the horror aspect and really the second half of the movie. And so I'm going to issue kind of like a mild spoiler warning. I'm not going to get into anything specific, but if you want to go into this thing completely dark and not knowing anything, I would say jump to this point in the video so you can avoid all of this. So with that being said, though, let's kind of get into that second half of the film and talk about the horror element of this movie. So what ends up happening is one of the mercenaries discovers that the guy who is housing them at the inn that they're staying at is from his past, and he was this like abusive kind of military leader who had they were imprisoning and capturing these boys and trying to turn them into youth soldiers and things like that. And so he discovers him and he ends up killing him, and once he kills him, it unleashes this ancient curse on this land and on this territory. And so we start to deal with this supernatural entity who shows up to try to kill everybody. And unfortunately, none of the horror elements of this movie really work for me at all. It is not really suspenseful. It's not really scary. There's not really any good blood or gore. There's not really any good kills. And the supernatural entity that we get manifests itself into like this swarm of bugs, and it's just not very scary or intense or, like I said, suspenseful. And so largely this entire second half, this horror element of the movie just largely falls flat for me. And I also just kind of have some kind of logical issues with this. There's a scene in the movie where one of the guys who's also staying at the inn is explaining to the mercenaries what this entity is, what they've just released on everybody, and he makes it very well known that their weapons and their guns aren't going to work here. They just need to run away and escape. And then they go out and start defeating this entity with their guns and with their swords and stuff like that. And it's like, but I thought that those things didn't work. And so there's just kind of some weird stuff there that don't make any sense. And the guy also explains to them that this entity attacks their five senses, and so they have to go around wearing headphones so that it prevents them from hearing this thing. And but like they can see it as well. So it's like they don't have to wear blindfolds or anything like that either. And so that kind of doesn't really make sense either. There's a scene later on where they drive to this other town to get these supplies, and they end up finding all these boys who are imprisoned there, and they release the boys, and so the boys are just out there running around escaping, but the entity doesn't attack any of the boys for whatever reason. It only attacks those guys. Then there's a scene towards the end of the movie where the characters do something that doesn't make any sense at all to me. I don't know why they had to make that decision and why they had to do that. They could have done something else, but for some reason, this is what they do, and it just doesn't make any sense. And so overall, this movie was just a disappointment for me. Like I said, that opening half kind of had this interesting setup, and I liked some of the visuals and the location, and the characters were even a little bit intriguing as well. But then once it transitions to a horror movie, that entire horror aspect of it just does not work for me at all, and really just fell flat. And as I said, I didn't really find it scary, and the entity that they have is just it's just not very scary and suspenseful, and there's not really any good scenes. And so there's also just a handful of just logical issues as well that I just didn't understand how things worked this way, or the why the characters were making certain decisions that they were making. And so in the end, this one just did not work for me. And so overall, I think my grade for this is going to be like a 4 out of 10 for Saloum. So those are my thoughts. Hit me up down in the comments, though. Let me know if you guys have seen this thing and what your thoughts are. Would love to hear from you. That's all I got for you. Thank you once again for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you like videos like this, that is all I do on The Haunted Beard. It is horror and thriller movie content coming at you, so hit that subscribe button. I would greatly appreciate it. And I'll see you next time on The Haunted Beard.